So I'm just going to lift the graphite from the very bottom here a little bit. And then what we're going to do is just put down a base layer using the warm grey one, just pretty much up to this area of the mouth, just in this bottom half here. So it's just going to be real simple. We're just going to shade. There's a very slight direction that we're just going to follow. So it's basically just going to shade downwards, so coming down. So just using a light pressure. Just shading all the way down towards the mouth. And once we've got that light layer there, we're going to go in with the burnt ochre. And we're just going to lightly shade in all of the markings that we can see. So all the markings that we've outlined with graphite, we're just going to go in and shade those. Just 4 little patches there that we're just adding in. So we're just going to go in with another layer of the warm grey one. Then we're going to go over the patches of the burnt ochre. Really blend them in. And then what we're going to do is just get slightly darker on these patches. Just going in with another layer of the burnt ochre. We're going to go in with some burnt sienna. Going to darken these up and get the shadows in these first, and then just go into the rest of the skin. So just slowly getting darker. Switching to some of the burnt sienna. So again, just lightly shading. Just going in with a slightly harder pressure where we do have some darker areas. And then to get even darker in some areas, we're going in with the walnut brown. So just lightly shading and just increasing the pressure where we need to, just to get slightly darker. But you just want to keep shading, you don't want to make any fur lines or anything, everything's nice and smooth, so just keep shading, lifting the pressure just to blend into lighter areas where you need to as well. Okay, so the markings are all nicely marked up now, so we're going to take the warm grey 3 and we're just going to increase all of the shadows. So there's a majority of the shadow is underneath, so just along the sort of jawbone. So I'm just taking the pencil on the side and just lightly shading just underneath, just following that graphite line that I've just slightly erased. I'm going to follow it all the way along. Now on this lower section there is a little bit of burnt ochre and a little bit of like a nougat-y brown kind of shadow here, so we will be adding in some nougat and some of that burnt ochre as well. We're just adding the warm grey 3 down as a base. And just continuing some of the warm grey 3 up through the top, and just adding in some areas where we do have some darker tone just by increasing the pressure on the warm grey 3 as we're shading. So going over the markings as well. Just helps to blend everything really nicely together. I'm going to start to add in some of the nougat. And some of the walnut brown as well. And then just blend it out with the warm grey 3. It's nice and smooth. I'm also just going to take some of the sky blue and just mix that into some of the shadows, just to give it a little bit of extra depth. And along the very bottom edge here, I'm going to just add in some nougat. So we need this quite dark along the bottom edge. So just adding a light layer to the bottom first of all, just lightly shading. I'm just holding my pencil on the side here because it's quite a short one. And then we can just increase the pressure. I'm going to introduce a little bit of the Caput Mortuum Violet as well. Again, I'm just going to use the pencil on the side just so I get like a light shading, just like almost like a glaze of colour down. And I'm also going to just add in tiny little shadings just coming off of the markings of the burnt ochre, just so it sort of blends in a little bit more. And then just continuing with some of that Caput Mortuum Violet. And going in with a tiny little bit of the dark sepia as well, just to really darken it up. So we're just continuing to build in a little bit of form here, a little bit of the bone structure, just by going in with some more dark sepia and just accenting some of the darker, deeper shadows. I'm going to couple that with some of the walnut brown as well. And I'm going to take the white pencil and just accent a few little white highlights just by going in, using a bit of a harder pressure on the pencil and just blending this out a little bit, just so we get a few little like whiter highlights. And then going back in with some of the dark sepia and just shading around them just to make them pop a little bit more. So along the bottom there is also just a slight little bit of markings and things. So I'm just going back in with the burnt ochre, adding that in. A little bit of the burnt sienna as well. And there's just a little bit of a marking here that I haven't added in, which is really, really dark. So I'm just adding in the burnt ochre to begin with, and I'm just going to go straight in with some of the walnut brown. And just blend it back over with some of the burnt sienna. Now around that I'm just going to continue adding in some of the warm grey 3. Adding a defined edge to the jaw as well. I'm going to go in there with some walnut brown just to darken up the shadows just towards the mouth here. And using the warm grey 3 just to blend it back through so we don't have any harsh edges. Using a bit more walnut brown on the actual marking on the face as well. Adding a tiny little bit more burnt sienna as well, just to really make those colours pop. Okay, so then we just need to add in this tiny little section here, just continuing this sort of flecked texture, just bringing it down a little bit more. So I'm just going to continue adding in a little bit of the burnt ochre, just creating like little tiny dots. Just bringing this texture down a little bit. Then we're just going to switch to using some of the burnt sienna, doing exactly the same, so almost like dot-like markings, just bringing this down. And then just adding in some more warm grey 3, blending it over those little tiny markings. And also just adding a very slight hint of the Caput Mortuum Violet. Just a very subtle texture. Okay, so now that we have the basis of the shadows in, we can just darken up some of these markings. So I'm just going to take the Caput Mortuum Violet and just add in a really sort of harsh shadow across some of these where they are a lot darker. I'm going to even take a tiny little bit of the dark sepia and just lay that down through, just create like a crease. I'm also going to take the sky blue and add a little bit of this to the bottom, and it's going to mix with that Caput Mortuum Violet and just create a really kind of nice sort of mauvey purpley tone, which is the perfect shadow tone for underneath there. So now that we have that in place, we can move on to just adding this band across the nose. So just going to go like above the nostril here and then add in the carrying on this kind of texture down here, adding in this really prominent marking, and there's a lot of shadows just going on here, which we're going to be using a lot of Caput Mortuum Violet and the dark sepia for. We're just going to lift the graphite, just using my kneaded eraser. I'm going to put down a base layer of the warm grey 1. So just coming across the top of the nose. So we're just following the slight direction changes as well. So where it curls around the nose, it starts to come back down towards the bottom. We're just going to follow that direction slightly. Okay. So straight away we're going to just add in a couple of the markings, mainly this large prominent one here. So we're just going to add in that. You're just using the burnt ochre, so we have a nice sort of area to blend it out. So just using a light pressure and just shading back and forth. I'm also just going to shade in this little section here, just underneath it. This is where a lot of the shadow is falling here. Okay, so those are the main markings, all sort of mapped out there. We're just going to go over those with some of the burnt sienna. So again, just shading lightly. So the main one is this large section here. It's going to increase the pressure here a little bit. I'm also just going to go back over that with some more of the burnt ochre. So we're just increasing the pressure so we get this really sort of nice vibrant orange. Just increasing the pressure where we have some darker points on that, and just going in with some of the walnut brown. Okay, so now we can start to add in, I'm going to start up here and just add in this texture up here, and then we're going to get to all of that shadow. And this is one of the last difficult parts, just around the mouth here where we do have that shadow. So on the top of the head, we're just going to take the burnt ochre. We're just going to start to add in this texture, what we've got going on here. So we're just adding in fine, faint lines, just going down in the direction of the nose. And we're going to start to blend it into this large patch here. I'm also just going to add in a very slight patch that we've got going on here, just shading that in slightly. So just really lightly adding in some slight texture on the nose here. I'm going to switch to using some of the burnt sienna. Just doing exactly the same thing, just getting slightly darker and grouping the little strokes or the dots closer together where we do have like a darker section of this. I'm pretty much just going all over the entire thing, just making these tiny little markings, and what we're hoping to end up with is like this, just slight gaps in between so that it looks like a bit of a sort of almost like flecked type of fur. Almost like a brindle type of fur. So I'm just going back in and just defining the little section here a little bit more. I'm just going into this area here and just blending it out a little bit because there's a few of these little flecked fur bits just coming off of all of the sides of this little marking, this shape. Just blending it through. And then finally going through with some Caput Mortem Violet on the nose here. And then we can start to add in some Warm Grey 3. And start to just blend out this nose a little bit more. I'm just going to also take the burnt ochre and just increase the pressure just to get this really kind of nice vibrant orange tone down as like a skin base, just as we go into the nose where it becomes a little bit more sort of yellow toned. And I'm also just going to start to add in a tiny little bit of the raw umber just for that yellow tone once again. Just start to bring that into the nose. So we need to use the Warm Grey 3, and all we're going to do is just shade in between the areas on this patch all the way up to this darker area. So just shading, adding in that skin tone that we've added all the way throughout the portrait so far. Okay, we're also just going to add it all over here. This is where we're going to start to add the shadow as well. Okay, so we're going to work on this shadow and get as dark as we possibly can in this area, just directly underneath this patch here. So we're just going to increase the pressure on our Warm Grey 3 And just gently map in some of the shapes that we can see where this really harsh shadow and where the bone structure kind of sinks in a little bit more. So you really want to push quite hard. So there's some darker patches coming off of this as well, and blending through. And then as we come down towards the nose here, it gets a little bit more prominent in there, and then it gets lighter again. So it's just a small area of shadow, it's nothing too major or big. So we've just got this section here defined out. So first of all, we're going to add a layer of the sky blue. That's because there's a little bit of a blue tone showing through, so we're just going to add this down. And we're just going to go in with some nougat, some walnut brown, and some of the Caput Mortuum violet, and then finally some dark sepia just to finish it off. But just by adding in the sky blue, you can already see that there's a shadow forming there, which is perfect. So next off is using some nougat, and this is also just going to help to add that sort of brown tone, and it's also just going to be used to just blend out a little bit. So we're just going to soften the edges and blend out into the surrounding area a little bit, just by lifting the pressure off the pencil. We're going to switch to the walnut brown, and we're going to just darken up some of these patches, these little skin markings. I'm going to darken those up first. I'm actually going to add a little tiny bit of the dark sepia over there as well, just to really darken them up, because they are the sort of darkest parts within this. Just adding in the darkest sections first. Going over with the dark sepia and then just blending lightly out. Again, just lifting the pressure off the pencil just to blend that out. And we're just taking the walnut brown and just shading the shadow some more. So just going to continue to get a little bit darker around the marking here. Gradually and very lightly building up the walnut brown tone. And just increasing some of the blue tone here and there as well. Just gradually, softly building up the tone. Making sure we smooth it out just by lifting the pressure off the pencil as we come into the lighter areas. I'm going to switch to using some of the Caput Mortuum Violet. Also just going in there straight away with some of the dark sepia as well. And also just adding in a tiny little bit of the burnt ochre, where we do have a little bit more of an orange tone just through here. It's slightly sort of more darkened though. So switching between the Caput Mortuum Violet and the dark sepia just to increase the shadows on this top section, and just adding in a little bit of the burnt ochre here and there where we do have just a shining through of some of the orange. Just adding in a few more of these little tiny details, these little tiny dots, just to blend in this texture up here and just blend it through down to the bottom of the nose down here. I'm also just going through down the bottom section here in this light section, just blending out this marking a little bit, just adding in a little bit more burnt ochre. I'm going to add in some more burnt sienna. So you can see we've got this really lovely shadow here, and then you've got the lighter surroundings, and that's exactly what we're after. I'm just going to spend still a little bit more just defining some more of these darker lines and shadows just through the nose here. Just very subtle, very, very subtle. Adding a little bit more sky blue. Increasing the shadows down in the bottom half down here a little bit more, so just adding a little bit more walnut brown to this lower edge of the jaw. Like so. Okay, so now we can move on and just fill in the rest of the nose section. So before we add in a base layer, what we're going to do is just add in the shape of the nostril. So I'm just going to add in using the dark sepia, just the sort of leaf shape of the nostril here. Just outline it gently and then fill in that inner section. And I'm also just going to define some of the darker areas just on the lip down here, just using the walnut brown. So I'm just going to add in, going over the graphite, just adding in a line of the walnut brown. And just start to block in some of these areas of the mouth. Like so. So just a few sort of key points, just sort of fleshing in, just using some of the shades. So just adding some burnt sienna down here where there's a little bit of a crease in the mouth that I just want to make sure that we keep visible. Like so. So we've just got those main points in, and that is looking fab. So we're just going to add in a base layer of the warm grey one. So this area doesn't really have very much direction, so we're just going to add in a nice layer all over. I'm actually just going to go in and just lift the graphite around the edges just a little bit. So just a nice base layer all over, and then we're just going to start to fill in with some of the light flesh, also some raw umber, and we're just going to fill in with the burnt ochre and the burnt sienna. Now we do need to add in a little bit more of the texture from the nose up here. So we do need to go in and use a little bit of Caput Mortuum violet through here. So I'm just going to add in that texture first. Just using the same technique as up here, just using the tiny little dots and lines just to fill that in. This is quite purple in tone as well, so just adding this straight down is absolutely perfect. And we're just going to go sort of parallel with the nostril here. So I'm actually going to just fill that in with a tiny little bit of the light flesh, just lightly layered on top, and then just fill in with the burnt ochre, just doing exactly the same thing, just adding in tiny little lines. And then just going back through with the Caput Mortuum violet. Okay, so we're just going to just fill in some of the nostril around here. Now it does have a little bit of a yellow tone and a little bit of a brown tone, so we're just going to add in light shades of the burnt ochre to begin with. So I'm just using like a circular motion because this is like a velvety texture, so using a circular motion is just going to help us eliminate any sort of direction and eliminate the grain of the paper, so we get a really nice smooth finish. So I'm just adding in the darker sections first. So I'm just putting down a base layer of the burnt ochre, and then I'm going to go over with some of the nougat. So I'm going to go right up to the dark area that we defined first of all. So I'm just still using these circular motions, just really darkening this edge here, just increasing the pressure where we do have a slightly deeper tone of that brown. And then right in here and just going in with a really light glaze just to sort of fill that in there. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side, so just adding in a slightly darker brown tone. And just filling in the nostril with a slightly harder pressure on the dark sepia. I'm going to switch to using a little bit of the walnut brown just to really darken up around the edge there. And then we're just going to fill in around the edges, just using the burnt ochre and just really gently and softly filling the rest of that in. And then we're just going to expand the nougat, just using the pencil on the side in a light pressure just to really subtly blend out that edge there. Now we do need to get a little bit stronger on the orange colour, so I'm just going to increase the pressure where there's a slightly deeper orange colour. I'm also going to go in with some of the burnt sienna as well. I'm going to use the white pencil just to accent a little bit of a white area around the nostril, and again just going to go around that dark nostril with some of the nougat and just shade in that lighter patch. Now to really blend this out a little bit more, I'm going to just introduce a little bit more of the burnt ochre and just use that sort of spirally circular motion just to fill in that texture. And I'm going to use the burnt sienna just to add in some of that dotted texture around the outer edge and just blend through. Just using a little bit of the walnut brown, just filling in and shading some of the darker areas. Okay, so I'm actually going to use a little bit of the warm grey 3, just bringing in some of this skin, lighter skin colour around the nose. I'm also just going to switch back to using a little bit more of that nougat because we need to just add a little bit more of a nougat tone around the outer edge of the nostril here. and blend it into the lighter tones. So I'm going to switch back to using a little bit more of the burnt sienna to add a little bit more of a richer, warmer tone to some of these areas. And then on the front of the nose here, we're literally just going to shade the whole of this with the light flesh. So from this shadow area that we stopped, just going to shade this whole front lip nose section with the light flesh, and then we can go over with some raw umber. So just doing the top half of the mouth to begin with. I'm going to take the raw umber, I'm going to apply a really light layer of this to get a nice yellow tone. It's going right up to the nostril. Just really lightly shading. You just want to use a really light hand for this. So just getting the base colour of the sort of velvety skin down first. And once that's done, we can go over and start to add in some of the burnt ochre. So we're just following some of the darker areas now. So the darker areas are mainly on the left hand side of the nose here, and just on the top lip where it just sort of curves over. So I'm just going to add that in first. So again, I'm just shading. I'm just putting a little bit of pressure through the pencil as well, just to get a nice darker tone. And then blending and lifting the pressure to graduate out into the lighter area. I'm also going to add another layer of the raw umber over there because it's slightly like a yellowy tone. I'm also just going to add some more shadows and some more toning using the Nougat, just to continue this shadow and blend it out a little bit more. I'm going to use some of the burnt sienna just to add in some little tiny lines and folds like we did around the ears. I'm also just going to shade with some of the Caput Mortuum Violet for a little bit more of a purpley tone, to blend those sort of lines out a little bit. And again, just going in with some more burnt sienna, just lightly shading, just building the layers, blending the shadow out. There's some more darker orange areas just underneath the nose over here as well, so I'm just going to again just go in with some more of the burnt ochre, going over with some of the burnt sienna. And also just adding in some of the little tiny details through here, just increasing the pressure on the burnt sienna pencil to begin with. So just really lightly shading, just keeping the pressure really loose on the pencil, create this really nice kind of velvety texture of the giraffe. I'm going to add some of the Caput Mortuum Violet to this area, to darken it a little bit. Followed by some walnut brown. And I'm just going to work through the lip now and just blend in some more orange tones. Get it looking really nice and saturated with that colour. And just popping over a little bit of the burnt sienna over the top, and then blending out with a little bit more of the burnt ochre. I'm going to use a tiny little bit of the dark Naples ochre as well in this area. So just adding a layer of this down. Kind of blend it out with some more light flesh, so we get a nice sort of peachy, sort of almost neutral tone. And then just continue darkening this area around the lip as well. So the more that we darken the lighter areas, the more that we need to go in and really sort of add more depth to the shadows. It's really important that you make sure that you do that as you're working on the lighter areas. Just continually darken the darker areas as well. Otherwise you're going to lose the sort of contrast and the nice dark areas that you defined to begin with. I'm just darkening up some areas around here. Going in with some hard pressure on the burnt ochre. To get a good amount of pigment down there. And I'm going to fill it in some of this with some harder pressure on the light flesh. It's going to help to blend everything, and it's also just going to increase that sort of peachy tone around the mouth around here. So just continuing to add some of the darker little patches and just slightly darker pigmented areas on the giraffe. It's going to work more around this darker section here, just really darken it underneath the nose here so that the nose really pops. I think so. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how that is looking. Gonna go ahead and add some of the shading to the lower half now, and then we'll see if anything needs adjusting up here, but I'm pretty happy with the colour and everything of this. It blends in really nicely with the rest of the giraffe. I am just going to add in a slight little bit of shading with the Caput Mortem Violet, just using the side of the pencil just to build and blend this area down and into the nose a little bit more. But that's about it. That's all I'm going to do for that. So the lower half has already got the layer of the warm grey one down, so all we're going to do is just build in some of the light flesh. This is a lot darker on the bottom here, so we're going to be using a lot more of the sort of nougat tones down here. So I'm just going to build in the light flesh, just so we've got a couple of nice layers to layer all of our darker colours on top of. Also just going to slightly add in this dark bit just up to here, just adding in some of the warm grey 3. And a little bit of the burnt ochre just under here. I'm just going to shade some nougat on this section under here, just to continue that shadow. Okay. So this bottom section, I'm just going to go straight in with the dark sienna, or the burnt sienna, and I'm just going to start to add in the darker areas. Again, we're just going to lightly shade. So just shading in the really sort of dark areas, and I'm just using a medium pressure, so I'm not pushing extremely lightly, but I'm not going in with a really hard pressure, just somewhere in between. Just filling in all of the darker areas, so that's directly underneath this upper lip. And I'm going to go straight on top of that with some of the walnut brown. I'm just going to go all the way along the bottom lip here, just with the walnut brown, add in a darker shadow. I'm also just going to blend that out a little bit with the nougat. Just blending the lower lip into the top lip a little bit with just a tiny little bit of the walnut brown. I'm just going to use the white pencil just to gently line and highlight a little bit. I'm also going to take the dark sepia and just really darken up this bit just here, so right at the front. Just on that bit of the lip there. So with the rest of the areas, I'm just going to go into some of these with a little bit of a harder pressure on the burnt sienna. Just there, and a little bit here as well. And what I'm going to do now is just cover the whole thing with a layer or two of the burnt ochre. So with that layer down, I'm going to go in with some more of the burnt sienna. I'm just going to blend these out, just using a light pressure now. And just building in the rest of the tone. I'm also going to use a little bit of the Venetian red. So just layering a bit of that down as well. And just continuing with the burnt sienna. Just blending out the darker top lip a little bit. I'm going to take the walnut brown and just get a little bit darker, just to increase the sort of shadow element to some of this that's underneath here. I'm going to use the Venetian red. to add a little bit more of a pinker sort of red element, and just going back in with some more of the burnt sienna, just shading that down, using a little bit more of the nougat as well. I'm going to use a tiny bit of the dark sepia. Making sure that everything is nice and smooth and blended. And then with the burnt sienna, I'm just going to bring off a few little hairs off of the chin, just really sort of light, little tiny hairs. So just going to highlight a little bit in the mouth there. That's where it's catching the light. And all on the top muzzle here, I'm going to sharpen up the walnut brown and just add a few little tiny black dots or dark dots into the top lip here as well. So just tiny little dark dots. There's quite a few of them just on this top lip. So just using a nice sharp pencil and just sort of really tiny, intricate little dots on this little muzzle section. And there's a few really tiny little hairs, really faint hairs as well, which I'm just going to add just coming off the side of the giraffe. Just creating tiny little lines just coming off the edge on the bottom as well, just to give it that sort of fuzzy look. I am just going to use a little bit of the yellow to come over these lighter sections, just to give it a little bit of a yellow glow. And I'm really enjoying how that is looking. It's all lovely and shaded, so you just want to check that all of your shaded components are looking correct. You've got a nice contrast going on, everything is nice and blended out. And I'm really happy with how that's actually looking there. Just darken this bit up on the nose just here. And just realign this shape of this shadow here as well. So I just want to accent a few, or just these creases a little bit more. So I'm just going through them with a little bit of the walnut brown. Like so. Just using the Caput Morton Violet just to increase some shadows around the nostrils and everything. So I'm really happy with how that's looking. As I said, just make sure that your contrasts and your values are looking accurate on your giraffe. I can see just by adding in the nose here that I just need to go a little bit darker just on this section here. So I'm actually just going to go in with the burnt sienna and just darken up and just add a little bit more of a darker stroke. A bit of a heavy hand on this section through here. Just going to take the Warm Grey 3 adding a bit more shading there, and we're ready to move on to the neck area now. Okay, so the neck is actually a really simple process. What we're going to do first is just go in and lighten the graphite just with using a kneaded eraser or just a eraser, whatever you have. So then what we're going to do is just fill in all of the spots, all of the markings that we can see on the neck with the burnt ochre. So exactly the same process as what we do through here. So the markings on the neck are really large, which makes it really nice and easy as well. So this neck hardly has any texture and it's not really in focus at all. So we can just go in and just shade nice and gently. So a couple layers of that burnt ochre and get all of the shape in. Just filling in all of these large shapes. Just really soft and gentle, especially where you do have some like lighter areas. Okay, so we've got all of the shapes of the neck in there. So what we're going to do is go in and exaggerate some of the darker ones, just for going in with some of the burnt sienna. So mainly there's one directly underneath the chin here. So again, just using some soft shading. Just going over slightly adding in the burnt sienna. Obviously where you have lighter patches, just go in with a lighter pressure, but where you do have some darker ones, you can just go in with a bit of a harder pressure on your pencil just to get that colour laid down. So I'm just darkening this one down here where we have a little bit of shadow and some lighter tone on the stripe or the spot itself, and I'm just going in with another layer of the burnt ochre and blending that through, just using a little bit of a harder pressure on the burnt ochre at this stage. So you should end up with some really nice dark spots, and you've got the sort of beginnings of shadows and everything on these. So what we want to do now is just add a base layer of the warm grey one. I'm just going to add this all over. We're going to go over these spots and everything. Just filling in all of the areas in between. Okay, so with that base all the way down, we can then go through and start to darken up and add some shadows with the warm grey 3. I'm also going to just bring out the sky blue because we have a really blue shadow over here, right on the left hand side here. So I'm just going to straight away bring in the sky blue and just add this shadow down. And whilst we're doing this, I'm going to use the burnt sienna and the walnut brown to just continue to darken these spots and everything. I'm also just using the burnt ochre, just adding a nice firm layer over this. Going in with the walnut brown, nice sharp pencil, light shading, just adding down a little bit of a darker tone. So we've got a nice, really dark tone on that spot there. We're going to do this one as well. So exactly the same thing. Just going in with a harder pressure on the burnt ochre. Going in with some more of the burnt sienna. And then going over and darkening with the walnut brown. So again, we're just going to go in and exaggerate some of this blue tone behind and underneath the ear. I'm going to add in a tiny little bit of the Caput Mortuum Violet in there as well. And blend with the warm grey 1. So I'm going to continue with the warm grey 3, just around underneath the neck up here. So we're going to start at the top and work our way down. So I'm just adding down a light layer of this and just increasing the pressure where we do have a slightly darker tone. So just really increasing that pressure. And we're going to add a tiny little bit of the nougat and the Caput Mortuum Violet to that as well. And then just blending some of the warm grey 3 through this spot here, just lightly through that one. I'm going to add some blue, just trailing down as well. I'm going to take the burnt sienna and just add in a little bit of a darker tone to this spot just here. Maybe use some walnut brown just to really darken it underneath the neck, underneath the chin or jaw, like so. And it just sort of blends into the skin a little bit more, that one. So we're just going to continue taking the warm grey down. So we're going to work on this spot here. So again, we're just going to use a harder pressure over the marking with the burnt ochre. Let's get it as smooth as possible. Then we're going to take the burnt sienna and then the walnut brown. So using the walnut brown, just going to shade over this one, pretty much all over, so we darken it. And then just add some darker areas just by increasing the pressure on the pencil. So as we come down this one, I'm just going to continue with the warm grey 3, and I'm going to mix in a little bit of the sky blue in with this as well. I'm going to blend in a little bit of the Caput Mortuum Violet as well for a little bit of a purpley tone. And then I'm going to use the walnut brown just to add some edges to this marking here, just give it a little bit more of an inconsistent edge. So we're going to fill in this spot and this area here. So through the middle of these spots, we're going to just add some more warm grey 3. A little bit more of the blue, so just bringing some more sky blue through. And also just using the Caput Mortuum Violet to add a little bit of shading and tone to the actual skin. And I'm actually going to use the walnut brown just to add a little bit more of an inconsistent edge up here. and just to blend in the edges of the spots a little bit more, so just blending into the skin with some of the walnut brown, just to break up so it's not quite as like straight edged. So we're just going to fill in this spot here, so exactly the same process. This is one of the last ones to do, so we're just going to use a hard pressure on the burnt ochre. Going in with the burnt sienna. So I'm only going to concentrate the burnt sienna like into the lighter area and blend it through. Then taking the walnut brown, using this pretty much all over. I'm just going to add a little bit of interest into the edges again, so it's just not quite so like straight. Increasing the shadow on this as well. I'm going to introduce a tiny little bit of green into this one just to tone down the orange in this shadow section. I'm also just going to add a tiny little bit of green into this one. Then we can just continue adding the warm grey 3 to the skin. So just going in with a harder pressure where we have some really dark areas on the skin, and just blending them out into the surrounding areas just by lifting that pressure off. I'm going to go into this shape here just straight away with the walnut brown because it's really dark, this one. I'm going to use some of the dark sepia to really darken that up, and then again just going in with the warm grey 3 and adding in the shading. So when we come around to underneath the neck here, it becomes a whole lot darker. I'm just going to finish off this line of the neck down here. I'm going to blend that out with the white down here just to really smooth it out. I'm actually going to introduce a little bit of the blue through the shading on the back of the neck here as well. I'm just going to get harder on the warm grey 3. I'm going to use the nougat to add some light shading. Give a bit more of a brown tone here. A little bit more of the burnt sienna as well, just to really sort of get that marking in there. I'm going to blend that out so it's really nice and smooth with the white pencil as well. I'm going to add a tiny little bit of yellow to this lighter section down here, like so. And I'm also just going to lightly add in some yellow into the front of the neck here. I'm going to go in with a little bit more of the walnut brown. I'm just going to continue to add some shading to the skin around some of these spots and markings. I'm also just going to peel this tape off the bottom so I've got a nice, actually I need to just add in the very bottom bit here. This is where the sort of mane of the giraffe is going. So I'm just adding in a little bit of this. I'm going over that with the walnut brown because it's really dark, the mane of the giraffe there. I'm also just going to go in there with some of the dark sepia, like so. So now I can just peel off this edge, so we've got a nice straight edge on the very bottom there. So we can just work on this very last section of shading just underneath the jaw of the giraffe here. So just going to work on this bit just up here. I'm going to add some more of the Caput Mortuum Violet. Blend it with the white. And use some of the dark sepia to exaggerate some of the shading just underneath the ear here as well. This whole section underneath the jaw just needs shading with the warm grey 3. And then we're just going to add in some of the nougat, some of the walnut brown and all of those lovely tones and just get it a whole lot darker. So I'm going to use the walnut brown to just shade in this marking here. and also this one directly underneath the jaw as well. So just using some really soft shading, just using circular motions just by holding the pencil quite flat to the paper. So I'm going to use the nougat just to add some shading underneath the chin here. So I'm just using a circular motion, just gradually getting darker. I'm also just going to add in, there's like a little bit of a curvature to the neck, a little bit of a ridge here, so I'm just going to add that in as well. And blend it out just by lifting the pressure off the pencil around the edges of that bit. So just really pushing quite hard now and getting right into there. Going to use the burnt ochre as well in there. And then going in with some walnut brown. I'm going to use some of the raw umber under here as well for a bit more of a yellow hue. Bit of like a golden hue underneath here. And I'm just going to continue around some of the blue tones as well. And get really nice and dark on this shape here. I'm just going to blend some of this out with the white pencil. Okay, so we're pretty much there on the giraffe now. All we need to do is just add some final tweaks. I'm just going to get a little bit darker on some of the spots just on the underside of the chin here. I'm also just going to blend this edge with a little bit of white just so it's sort of accented against these really dark colours. I'm also just going to add some of the dark sepia down, just pretty much all over this lower section, just really darken it up. Like so. Okay, so we need to just add the final finishing touch, which is the mane of the giraffe back here. So all we're going to do for that is just put down a layer of the burnt sienna. So we're just going to work from the top, but just slightly coming down a slight angle. So I'm just going to work just against the neck here. So just keeping it nice and shaded. So I've got a nice base down there, then we're just going to get a little bit harder in there. I'm going to use the walnut brown, add another layer and get even darker again. So what I'm actually going to do is just pick up the portrait and just move it just so I've got a slightly better angle. It's just much easier to get a firmer pressure to do it this way. So just slightly swapping the angle around just so you can put a little bit of a firmer pressure down there. Really tuck this into and around the ears. And we're just going to use the dark sepia and just add a few fur strokes through just to break it up a little bit. Just coming off the end slightly so we get a little bit of a sort of messier finish to the mane. Like so. And I'm also just going to add one or two little strokes of the burnt ochre through there as well, like so. And that is pretty much it for our giraffe. Just need to check it over and make sure all of the sort of light directions and all of the shadows are correct. I'm going to leave mine a couple of days as I always do and come back to it with fresh eyes and then make any adjustments that need making. But straight off, I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. It's turned out pretty nice. I love all of the tones. It's got a nice consistent colour palette across it. So we didn't really use too much of the Venetian red or the light flesh or the yellow, but they were just there just to add little tiny hints and accents of colours here and there. If anything, I could probably add a little bit of the yellow to the little horns up here, just a really light glaze of colour and around the eye and that sort of thing, just to accentuate some of the shadows. But that's pretty much it. I really hope that you have enjoyed this tutorial. This has been a really nice one to draw, and it's kind of like a really extensive lesson on shading, which is nice because I know a lot of my students have problems with managing shading and that kind of aspect. So hopefully you've enjoyed this one and you've managed to get a really nice smooth result. If you are struggling with the shading at all, then obviously have a little practice, have 1 or 2 attempts at this, because I think it's a really nice piece to create. And again, just got that really extensive lesson in shading and applying it to a drawing, so it's a really good one to really get the hang of. But I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye!